Have you ever wondered how to sketch in architectural perspective? Well, today we're going to learn. We're going to learn all about perspective drawing, and we are going to use a program called Morpholio Trace, which I think you all know pretty well, in order to elucidate the basic elements of perspective. But what I want to do first is actually start with a quick review of some of the basic drawing techniques in Morpholio, because otherwise it'll be hard to follow along if you can't remember from so long ago when you all learned. And first of all, I'm here in Morpholio Trace, and I'm going to just click the cog button here to make sure I've set my settings. And you might be able to tell from the video that I am left-handed, so I like to have this pencil-only drawing option checked, because I tend to drag my fingers as I draw, and this prevents you from sort of accidentally drawing lines. Other settings here, you can even control the default line weight, default layer color, and there's some other settings here. Layer background can be transparent or white. Stacking layers is a good one. If you check that, you'll see a kind of white background whenever you add a new layer, and it will be added at kind of the zoom and rotation location. I tend to just leave that off. I don't really need the effect of having sheets of tracing paper. There is a left-handed mode which swaps the controls, but obviously most people are right-handed, so I think I'll just stick with that. So those are the general settings. And you'll see here across the top there are a number of basic ways that you can start a drawing, including using a library, just setting a blank drawing. There's also a 3D model option, which is great for SketchUp models. And there's also a maps option and a camera option. But I actually have one that some of you hopefully have gotten by now, a perspective drawing lesson already created here. I'm going to click on that one. And the reason that's handy is because it has all the stuff we need to learn, which is these basic elements. And I'm going to start with a one-point perspective. And these elements are the basic pieces that define what a perspective drawing is and why do we call it a one-point perspective. And let's start over here and draw a quick plan. Oops. And to draw in Morpholio Trace, you basically use drawing tools. Here they are on the left. There's different ones. You can just click on them. If you kind of long press or double tap on one, you'll see that there's different tools, grease pencils and markers and stuff. I think I'm just going to use a pen for now, just like the way it looks. And each pen, each tool also has options for the size. You can just kind of scroll up and down in the list. I'll choose a medium size, and you just pick the color by tapping on it. See, when you tap it, it becomes available over here on the left. Now, also on the right side, you'll see the layers palette. And like a lot of our architectural software, you can stack layers. You can turn them on and off by just clicking the little eyeball. And each layer has kind of these different modes. You can make the paper white or yellow or whatever. That's the tracing quality. You can lower or raise the opacity of the layer, but also of the paper. And so what happens is if you have a bunch of these sheets stacked up on top of each other, they do tend to get a little gray. So I usually just drag that down to 0. Works fine for me. And you just double tap on a layer to make it current. If you double tap on a layer with text in it, it will zoom in on the text and start editing. So don't do that. Just tap to come back to the screen. And by the way, if you tap with 4 fingers, it makes all the menus go away. Tap again, and they come back. So I'm going to double tap on one of these layers, and I'm going to draw myself a little floor plan here. I'll just draw it up in the upper right here. And drawing, I've got a pencil, okay. The other thing to know, hopefully this comes back to everyone, is that there's a couple of drawing aids up at the top. The ruler is one of my favorites because it's easy to move around, and you can draw lines up against the ruler, but you can also draw lines and they will snap to the rule, even vertically. They'll snap 90 degrees to what you've where the ruler is set. You don't need to draw against the ruler. You double tap on the ruler and it will rotate it 90 degrees. Of course, if we're just drawing a square plan, we don't need to do that. By the way, double tapping tapping with 2 fingers is undo here in this software. So there we go. I've undone everything. And I'm just going to draw a quick floor plan here. And we'll start with an interior 1-point perspective. Okay, so there is a very simple floor plan. And one of the first things you want to identify is where you're standing. This is called the station point. And I'm going to use a big dot, and maybe I'll make it red. And let's just say we're standing right here in the middle. I'll tap it a couple of times to get a nice dark dot. Then you'll want to choose or identify your line of sight. The line of sight is basically where you're looking. And here I'll draw a nice light green line. And the line of sight, in this case, we're starting here at the station point, and we're looking right at this back wall. Okay, there's my little attempt at an arrow. That was a very sloppy arrow. So that's the line of sight. We're looking at the back wall, and by default, that angle is 90 degrees. The reason that it's 90 degrees is that's the definition of a 1-point perspective, is that your line of sight is perpendicular to the picture plane, which I'll explain in a minute. The picture plane in a 1-point perspective is the back wall. So here, let's draw the picture plane, and the picture plane is right here. It's the back of the space. So again, the definition of a 1-point perspective is that line of sight is perpendicular to the back wall. So here, let's draw in some little notes so we can remember what's what. Whoops, don't do that. Let's draw a nice, fun line connecting these different pieces. That's the picture plane. That's the line of sight. And that little fella is the station point. So that is, those are the first 3 elements, and that is what defines a 1-point perspective. When you have your line of sight perpendicular to the picture plane. Now, what does that mean in terms of actual perspective drawing? So let's come down here, and we'll try drawing a perspective, the actual point of this whole thing. And I'm going to keep this part of the view available because it is actually important to be able to locate the vanishing point and the back of the space here. First of all, the vanishing point is right in line with the station point and line of sight. So I'm going to just tap my red dot tool, and I'll just start right here in the middle. Here, let me get this out of the way so I can tap on that a couple times. That's the vanishing point. And by default, the picture plane is basically, like I said, the back wall. So I'm just gonna draw in the back wall. I'm gonna use this ruler to help me find this exactly. And of course, we've just drawn it in plan. We don't know how high this space is, but the floor, the horizon line is defined as the distance above the floor. So let's just say the floor is about here, and let's say the ceiling is about here. I'll draw it as roughly a square space. And what that means, if your eye height is, say, at about 5 feet high, this space is probably about 10 feet tall. In order to create a perspective, you draw what are called extension lines. And these go from the vanishing point out to through the corners of the space. In fact, everything that is parallel to your view, by which I mean everything which is on these side walls of the plan, those are going to follow these extension lines here. I'll make them a little lighter so they're not so distracting. And you'll notice, by the way, that the ruler likes to snap to 45 degrees. You can set the angles that it snaps to, but you can also kind of wiggle it back and forth a couple of times like this, kind of wiggly, wiggly, and that loosens up the snapping and allows you to just kind of draw freehand. So there you go. You have yourself the basic elements of perspective. And let me draw in some of these note lines. Again, the picture plane is defined as that back wall, and you're drawing that in elevation. That is a flat orthographic view. The vanishing point aligns exactly with that line of sight. So wherever you're standing in your floor plan, and whichever direction you're looking, you can carry that line down, and that is your vanishing point. The horizon line is defined as, first of all, goes through the vanishing point, and second of all, it is the distance above the floor. Okay, so when you draw that elevation, that's kind of where you're holding your camera if you're holding it. Finally, you draw these extension lines, and these help you to create the perspective. So let me draw a perspective. Now that we finally learned all these different things, I'm going to lower the opacity of this layer, and so that it's just kind of in the background. And I'll make this layer my current one, use a nice black pencil, and I'll draw it freehand so it shows out as distinct from the other layer here. A little easy to see. And there you go. Now I can draw a perspective. And this perspective, in theory, could keep going forever, but you can essentially end it by drawing in a box at the front of the room. Of course, I kind of didn't quite draw those long enough, but you see how that box meets, and that is an interior one-point perspective. So how do we translate this knowledge into a photograph or a rendering of a space? It's pretty simple. Let me go, and I'm going to switch my sheets here. I'm going to go, and I have a photo of a one-point perspective. There it is. Now, just in case you aren't able to access my drawing, it is actually quite easy to add a an image to your file, your project. Just tap on the image tool, and you can go to your library, and anything that's in your project or on your iPad is available for loading into your drawing. Another way that you can get images into your Morpholio program, you can actually go to either the internet, or I'm here in Canvas, our learning management system, and there's almost always a share button. And if you're lucky, Morpholio will be right here in your share options. You just tap share with Morpholio, and what it will do is it will send it to the Trace program, and like it says, open Trace to start. Let's see if it shows up. And there it is. You can open a file, and you've got your image right there. And first of all, we can draw this perspective here. We can sketch the plan of the perspective. It's a little tricky because we only see a little part of the space, but you can see there's kind of a sidewall and a window, and then kind of this concrete thing, and then another window. So we can kind of draw it, and I'll have ortho on here. Who knows? Maybe it's some kind of concrete. Whoops. Some kind of concrete. Does not want to draw straight, does it? Not today. And perhaps there's this giant concrete box here. And then there's a nice window and another nice window. Okay, now this is the plan, and let's go and draw the elements that we were talking about before. Where are we standing? Well, you can see that we're looking at just a little bit of this sidewall here. So we're probably standing just to the left of that sidewall. So we're probably standing about here, okay? And the line of sight is going to be straight through that vanishing point, right? That's our station point. And it's going to go directly at that back wall, if I can draw an arrow. That's not a very good arrow at all. Here, let's try that again. I have to get my pencil a little more carefully. And of course, I probably should just zoom in and make this a little bit easier. And the picture plane, by default, is the back plane of the space you're looking at. And again, when you're looking at a photo or you're doing a rendering on the computer, you can see that this back wall is basically an elevation, either interior or exterior. Anyway, so here we go. We've got this back wall here. That is the picture plane. All right, and we could label these. And I'll just turn off my ruler, and I could type in the labels, but we could just do it this way. Picture plane, station point, and line of sight. Okay. Now, when you're, if you want to draw on a perspective, and that's kind of the whole point here, is to be able to sketch onto a perspective drawing, add in, say, furnishings, or even just people, like it's kind of lonely in this space, you kind of work in reverse. Now, I have identified where all these elements are in plan view, but actually, when I go to use this drawing and manipulate it, I'm going to want to recreate it. And to do that, you actually kind of work in reverse of what we learned in our previous lesson. I'm going to start by drawing the extension lines of the space and then see how well I can locate that vanishing point. And we'll find out, if it really is kind of just to the right of that, or just to the left of that wall, and it looks like it is. I'm just going to draw a couple of these, and you can see I'm a little bit off on that one. So you want to really kind of get that rotation in there just right. And again, I could freehand this and it would be, much more approximate. Don't quite have it there. But using the ruler does kind of make a sharper edge. So that's pretty close. And that allows me to locate the vanishing point, right there in the middle. And then I'm going to want to draw the horizon line. And I should be drawing, hopefully, on a layer. I forgot to check if I was drawing on a blank layer. That's probably a good thing to know. And let's draw this as a lovely green line. Or did I do it as blue? Let's do blue last time. And here you go. Here's my horizon line, right? And now with that information, and I can also draw in the picture plane back here. So I'm identifying these elements of perspective in this space. And you can see the drawing is like maybe just a tiny bit rotated on my screen, but pretty close. So these are the elements of perspective. And again, I can come in and do here, we'll make them blue like we did before. Extension lines and vanishing point and horizon line. Okay, and I could write the whole thing out, but it would just extend the length of my video even more. So these are the elements of perspective as they exist in this space. And the advantage of having these elements of perspective is that now I know where my horizon line is. I know where my vanishing points are. And I can tell here by the furnishings that the eye height is about, about 4 feet high. So a typical person is going to be a little taller than that. I could draw them in standing here on the floor. Okay, so that's the whole point of this. Also, if you put in furniture, if it's a wall cabinet or something, it would be much taller. And if it would be a chair or a coffee table, it would be much lower than the horizon line. So drawing 2-point perspectives is very similar. Well, let's go and I'll go to my 2-point perspective worksheet here. And the big thing with 2-point perspectives is, well, the rules are a little different. That's why there's 2 vanishing points. And there's a vanishing point left and a vanishing point right. And like we did last time, let's start with the plan view here. And the rule, the kind of thing which defines the 2-point perspective is that your line of sight, instead of being perpendicular to the back wall, it's actually looking right at a corner. So you're basically looking at an angle. And So to draw that as, let's draw that as a plan here, and let me start a new layer here. If we were to draw that as a plan, instead of drawing the plan at 90 degrees, I think I'll draw it as 45, and I'll draw a little square, perhaps, as the plan. Whoops, there we go. There's my floor plan. And like we did before, there is a station point. And the station point, I'll draw it in red, is going to be away from a corner. We're going to be looking straight at a corner. So let's stand outside the building this time. And my line of sight is going to be, oh, let's make that a little lighter, is going to be right at the building. Right at the corner of that building. See how it looks right at the corner. Now, if I was doing an interior, it would be looking at the interior corner. All right. Now, either way, and of course, you'd be standing inside the space. Here, we'll put one inside the space just for reference there. Okay. Now, if where does that leave the picture plane? Well, like I said, the picture plane is perpendicular to the line of sight. So it's a little funny this time. I mean, if you find these things funny, which is to say, it's now perpendicular to this wall here, this corner. So the horizon, or the picture plane, is actually meeting the building at a funny angle. And of course, I chose 45 because it's easy to draw, but it could absolutely be any random angle. You could get a more distorted perspective. And interiors work the same way. Your picture plane is perpendicular to your line of sight. That is the definition. And oh, look at that. It lands right there next to the picture plane line. How handy. So what does that mean about the vanishing points? Well, the way you determine a vanishing point in a two-point perspective is a little funny. You draw an extension line, and here I'll draw them as yellow, because I haven't used yellow. No, purple. Let's go purple. Haven't used purple yet. You draw the extension lines, and it's the definition of an extension line here in two-point perspective is you start at the vanishing point and you go at a 45. Or you go at an angle that is parallel to the wall that you're drawing from. I just happen to have drawn it at 45. And that intersection is where the vanishing point is. And you go the other direction, of course, there's two walls here, and that intersection is where the other vanishing point is. And these have the cleverly named vanishing point left, and which is this one, and vanishing point right, which is this one. Now this works the same way with an interior perspective. You start at your your station point. Whoa, that's a really thick line. You start at your station point. You go parallel to that wall, that right wall. Go parallel to that, and where it meets the horizon, the picture plane, is where that vanishing point left and right is. And you can see the farther away you get from those walls, essentially the wider these two vanishing points are going to get. And that makes sense. The farther away you get from a wall, the more you see, basically, in your perspective view. So there you go. These are the two basic elements. And actually, while I'm drawing my little arrows here, there's a nice feature here called smoothness. I can make my lines a little more smooth, and I think that'll make for nicer lines, don't you? So here, oops, except I don't need my ruler. I'll draw an arrow for these picture planes. The line of sight is the green one. And the station point, as we saw, is this one. Oh boy, now I'm really getting into trouble with my arrows. And then the vanishing point left and right, you can see here. The vanishing point left is way over there, and the vanishing point right is over here. It's always good if you can not cross your arrows, but it's a little tricky. So anyway, all right, that's not the most clear way of describing it. I suppose I could have just labeled these, but anyway, that is the definition of how you get a 2-point perspective. Now, how does that actually work when you want to draw the drawing? Well, let's draw the exterior here. And like we did before, we're going to use our station point, and we're going to carry a line down from that station point to determine our kind of eye height. Okay. And our eye height is defined as the horizon line, okay? But let's pretend that, and this first vertical line, the one that is parallel to the line of sight, that is known as the measuring line. And the reason it's a measuring line is in the old days when you would construct these totally from scratch, you would use that line to measure off of an elevation. We're not going to do that though. Anyway, so the horizon line, I'm just going to kind of arbitrarily place it kind of low. Let's draw it blue. So here's my horizon line. And let's draw that a little darker so we have a little more oomph in our horizon. There we go. Now, how do you determine the vanishing points? Well, it's quite simple. You carry them down from your plan construction. And I'll just draw them like I have done before in red. And I'm using the ruler just so I can get it kind of close, close to where it is. Make those a little darker. So those are the kind of basic building blocks of a 2-point perspective. A horizon line, a measuring line, and the vanishing point left and vanishing point right. And what you do in order to create a perspective of an object, for example, and we're zoomed way out in this one. Let me lower the opacity of this layer so it's not quite as strong, and make myself a nice, a brand spanking new layer to draw on. Oops, I guess I made 2 of them. And we'll just come in here with a line, is you draw lines up to the measuring line. Oops, I'm drawing on the wrong layer here. And I'm just going to use freehand here. But you can see how on this measuring line, let's say this is the top of the building and this is the bottom of the building. You know, we could even make it a little higher, but you draw from each vanishing point, you draw essentially an extension line. And you're looking at the corner of the building, so you have to draw that in. And I just erased the edges here so that you can get a better sense of what the building looks like. I'll just turn off the perspective here, and you can see that that looks like a real simple building in perspective. Now, what if you want to draw an interior perspective? Well, it's basically the same rules here. I'm going to draw, let me bring this back up to 100% opacity. The trick is with a 1-point perspective, you do the same thing. You have your vanishing points, you have your horizon line, you have your measurement line, and then you draw extension lines. In this case, it's really important to draw them past the measuring line, and I'll show you why. I'll just come in here and draw a perspective drawing. We'll draw it in black. And the big difference here is you're drawing an interior, so you need these extra lines. And I'll just draw these out from the edges here. That to make this look like an interior, turn off the perspective lines, you need to have that extra length. You don't need the part, the interior part that goes back to the vanishing point. So either way, tracing these extension lines allows you to make a fairly convincing perspective. And if you wanted to draw in, oh, I don't know, a scale figure or something, well, having that horizon line, you know, because I made the horizon line pretty low, this could actually be a fairly big space. I could draw in a scale figure standing on the ground. Okay, and it looks correct in scale because I'm using that horizon line and all my knowledge of perspective to draw it. So how does all this work on a picture. Well, let's take a look at our one of our photos here that I have posted. Go to this view here, and this is a 2-point perspective. And how do we know it's a 2-point perspective? Well, let's draw the floor plan first. And if you remember the floor plan, the rule is that it's actually, you're looking at the corner of the floor plan. So I'm going to come in here, take a moderate drawing tool, whoops, get rid of those little lines. Let's draw this floor plan at 45 degrees. And by definition, the station point is just off the corner of this plan, okay? And we're looking at an exterior, so the station point is outside. If this were an interior, we would draw it off of the interior corner, right? That's just kind of the rule of how we draw. And whoops, oh, we don't need that. The line of sight basically goes from the corner of the building through the station point. And that's true if it's the exterior or the interior. You just start at the corner and you see how well I did placed my station point. Not particularly well. Let's draw this over a little bit. So your line of sight, like before, is looking at these corners. And then by rule, the picture plane is perpendicular to that line of sight. And I'll just draw that right over here. Same with an interior. The picture plane is still perpendicular to that line of sight. Now, the big difference with a 2-point perspective, we don't have the picture plane parallel to the back wall, which means we could just draw an interior elevation or an exterior elevation and we're done. We have to draw extension lines from the station point to the horizon line. And what this does, this will help us locate the left and right vanishing points. Where they intersect the picture plane, that is where the vanishing point, in this case the vanishing point left, or if I drag this guy around, the vanishing point right. I'll just draw my little reference lines in there. Again, station point goes and where it intersects the picture plane, those are the vanishing points. This is my vanishing point left, exterior or interior, vanishing point right, exterior or interior. And I could label these. By the way, when you draw, you can have more or less smoothness, and this is nice if you want to have smooth arrows or lines. And I'm going to make this a little less smooth so I can I can write in letters and have it be somewhat legible. So this is the vanishing point left, the vanishing point right, and of course this is the same, vanishing point left, vanishing, that's terrible, vanishing point right. This is the station point. And this is the line of sight. And these are extension lines. So these are all the basic elements we saw before. And this helps us to understand, yes, indeed, this is a 2-point perspective. Now, when you're drawing your own drawings, of course, you need to think about that and make sure you compose them correctly, that you are, in fact, looking at a corner of the room. That's kind of the whole point of this exercise. Now, how does this all translate into our perspective drawing? Well, it's quite simple. You have all the same elements. You have a measuring line, which may or may not be perfectly vertical. Let's see if we can, I think it's ever so slightly off here. And then, like we did with the 1-point perspective, we can kind of reverse engineer it and draw extension lines from the edges of the building and see if we can recreate the horizon line and the vanishing points. We can draw in our vanishing point left and vanishing point right. And again, this is so helpful. Now we know where all these elements are. We could say, if we wanted to, draw in people or objects or furnishings or cars at the correct scale. the next part of hand drawing is actually kind of an exercise in tracing, but we're going to trace very consciously using different line weights. And when you're drawing a perspective, now we know all the rules, we know where all the vanishing points are. And of course, this image that we're about to trace has a lot of pattern, which will help us to trace it. But basically, should always be 3 line weights when you draw really any drawing, but in particular, perspective drawings. Those line weights are cues to depth. So the heaviest line weight is going to be, let's not use a pencil. Let's use a pen so I can really see. And I'm going to draw this freehand. You may prefer to draw it using straight edges, but that's quite time consuming. And I'm also going to up my smoothness here so that I can get a little nicer line quality here. My hand is a little jittery. And so the heaviest line weight, I'm going to go with about a 9, or maybe we'll exaggerate a little bit, about a 12. And you'll want to go over the outline of the space. Now, in this case, this is an interior. So whatever defines that interior space, the edges of the room, those are going to want to be the heaviest line weights. Whoa, that's a little too heavy. Let's go with 9. So for example, this edge of the concrete, this is really the thing which defines the edge of the space. Same with this window here. And of course, I'm going to stop. I am tracing, so I'm going to leave out some of those furnishings. And let's just pan over here a little bit. That's pretty much it. That's the edge of my room. I probably should draw the edge of this window frame here. I'm going to draw these outer lines in a slightly lighter line weight. I think that might look better. But that's the edges of the room. Oh, I guess I do have this one here. That defines the space. And let's turn off the image for a second. You can see that you can already get a sense of what the room is like, even though you only have a couple of lines. Now, the next line weight down, and I'm going to exaggerate it a bit by using 4.53, which is kind of a random number. I'm sure it's metric. As the next line weight, that is going to define the kind of major elements in the space. If there are any openings or, in this case, windows, any large pieces of furniture, the outlines of those objects are going to be this line weight. If you're drawing an exterior, by the way, those will be the major elements in, say, a building. And we'll draw an exterior for the next one. These major elements, for example, might be this piece of furniture, and I'll just draw the outline of the piece of furniture. And this seems to have some objects on it. Just the outline. I'm not drawing every little piece. And this window frame here and the outside of the building, I'll draw those. And it's a matter of judgment as to whether or not those lines are going to be this medium line weight or a heavier line weight. I could have probably drawn that one as a heavy line weight, but I know that I'm going to add in some more line work next. So let's turn this off, and you can see there's a hierarchy of lines here. And you can start to see that, oh, these are different than these heavier lines. The heavier lines, again, are kind of space or form defining, mass defining, whereas these smaller line weights tend to be object oriented. Now, finally, there is a third line weight in our 3 line weight worldview, and I'm going to go with a real light line weight here, and this is for detail items. So, for example, all the fussy little lines that are inside this chair, I can draw those in. The thickness of window frames, I could draw that in, and I'm going to exaggerate it just a little bit here. I can exaggerate it a little bit less here on this window because there actually is visible quite a distinct window frame. Even some things like the flooring, or if I wanted to hatch in some of these flooring elements, I could totally do that. And then if there are any, say, edges of pieces, there's a little funky light fixture here, some sort of outlet on the wall. All of these little elements you could add in. You could even try to texture in some of this ceiling, rough board, concrete form texture. And that in its own can become kind of a stylistic element. But this lightest line weight is reserved for kind of these detail items. So let's turn off our base layer, and you can see you can really get a good sense of what the space is like and some of the details. Perhaps maybe the materials are looking a little funky, but those are the 3 line weights that you use to sketch an interior space, interior perspective. What about if it's a 2-point perspective? Let's go and we'll switch to our 2-point photo here. And here, I'll just add myself a new layer. And what you'll see is that it's basically the same idea. You have 3 different line weights. I'm going to use the outline line weight to kind of draw the edge, the edge of the building here. And often with buildings, you'll see that people, and these are exaggerated line weights, but I think they look good, that they'll kind of draw around a lot of the pieces of the building in order to kind of emphasize the overall shape. Also, typically, you're going to have a heavy line wherever the horizon is, and that kind of anchors the building. And in this case, we actually have kind of an opening in the building, so I think I will draw those as a heavy line weight. You might say, well, why didn't I draw the front edge of the building? Well, interesting enough, for exteriors, it somehow anchors the drawing very nicely when you have this outline shape. And then you drop down the line weight for these more internal elements of the building. So for example, I'll just draw this as a simple shape here. I didn't do a very good job there. I'll draw this as a simple shape. And you can see that these major pieces, these major openings, in this case, there's this opening here, this kind of slash of windows. And now I can draw in kind of the pilotis that the building is sitting up on in this medium line weight. And any other elements, there's clearly some kind of building element back in here. Okay. And let's turn off our background image. You can see that these major elements now suddenly are a little more legible because you can see by the line weight cue that they are minor elements. I think I'll add in this diagonal piece here. I think it kind of helps define the space. Yeah, that seems to work. Finally, you, like we did before, will want to use a light line weight for some of the detail items. For instance, these, oops, that wasn't very good. These diagonal or linear elements here, you could draw those in. You could draw in these little kind of, I don't know what they are, boxes, probably window openings. And again, I know that everything is going towards the vanishing point, so it's quite easy to trace all these elements. I could also draw these little window mullions here. It's kind of part of the patterning of the building. And I could come in and draw all these door frames. Finally, you can draw in elements in the distance, draw in some of the kind of elements in the landscape, or these interesting sculptural items. I'm not quite sure what they are. And let's turn off the background image. You can see that you can get a pretty good sense of what the building looks like quite simply by just drawing in 3 different and distinct line weights. You can hatch in your drawings in a number of ways, but the simplest one is basically essentially a paint bucket tool. I'm going to tap this fill tool. There's a couple of different options for how it works. The target option will, as you move the target around, it will look for an area that has a kind of boundary to it. So you can see here, if I wanted to make this, say, blue, and maybe I don't like this blue, maybe I want a lighter blue, I can tap on the color, and then there's even a whole kind of world of different colors that you can use. Once you've kind of got the area selected, you can just click the paint bucket and it will dump paint in that area. And here, I'll turn that off so you can see what it looks like. And it actually does a pretty nice job usually of finding those areas. Here, I'll lower that opacity down. It's a little on the strong side. Or I'll leave it back up while I'm drawing. So that tool is certainly a nice one. And it works great when you have a bound area. So for example, if I wanted to paint this area, I don't really want to paint it that color, but I can go and, here, let's go back to our library, and I can choose maybe a tan or a grayish tan, something like that. Okay. And once you find the color that you like, you go through and hit tap. And this is a super quick way to finish your drawing with some nice coloration. But you might say, well, what's going to happen when I don't have a bound area? Here, let's get rid of that and dump my paint in there. What's going to happen when I have an area like the top of this that is not bound? Well, now when you use the paint tool, you can also use various selection tools. This is a kind of a lasso, yeehaw. You can also use a polygonal lasso, a circle or a rectangle. And a polygonal lasso, you can kind of start tapping to add different areas to the space. And here I'll just kind of keep tapping. And you can see when I finish tapping, it kind of selects the area. And then you can dump the paint in that area. Now it is important, you can see how it's kind of obscuring my lines, that you drag this down so that it's below the lines. But you can see how that makes a pretty nice nice drawing. And then we can come in here and we can drop the opacity down so it's not quite so strong. I could also manipulate the color to get different colors that are a little lighter. But this is a nice way to make your drawing kind of filled out. These simple areas of color are really effective. And you can also use an eraser tool to, and let's check and see what the opacity of the eraser is. We can lower it down and kind of erase some of the edges of this and kind of soften the way it blends into the background. You can also kind of tap and dab if you want it to have a little softer look. And finally, if you want to paint an area, but perhaps you want it to have a pattern instead of a color, here I'll make myself a new layer to show you how this works. You can come in with this same fill tool, and I'll use the target this time, see, get myself a nice area. But instead of filling with a color, if I tap this button up at the top here, the red, I don't know what that icon really means, to tell you the honest truth. There's all sorts of other materials that are in here that are actually quite nice. There's landscape materials, flooring patterns, that kind of thing. And you can even have some interior patterns that are kind of regular and repeated objects. Here, let's go with something stone-like. Doesn't really look like that. This is called a smart hatch. And you can see here, that it is indicating the what the pattern is going to look like. You can kind of swap it, negative or positive. You can also change the scale of it. So let's say you want the wall to have this kind of, I don't know, bigger stone look, like I'm going to redesign this space. And then, like before, you just tap the dump tool and it will dump that pattern in there. So kind of a fun way to create textures and other things in your projects. So the goal would be to finish coloring in the background of the drawing. Again, just neutral colors or patterns if you want to have fun. And this works for interior or the exterior perspectives. One of the other cool things you can do is add in a shadow. And shadows are really just filled areas on your drawing. So let's give ourselves a nice blank layer here. I think this is my top layer I can draw on. And I'll just use a filled area here, my filled area tool. And I'll just keep tapping here. Nice thing about the polygonal lasso, you can generally get pretty close to the shape. Just tap back at the beginning to complete the loop. Oh, and to undo the smart hatch, you just click the / button there to unhatch, I guess is the right word. Anyway, once you've got the area selected and painted, you can just click the paint bucket, and there you go. You've got yourself a layer, and then you can add some of the other blending modes. For example, multiply is a great blending mode to kind of soften the way that the material is blended with the layers below. You can see a little bit of the, texture below it. Obviously, we can lower the opacity as well. And there you go. You have yourself a nice shadow on the wall. And I could draw a polygonal area for these other shadows as well. One fun and simple way to make your drawings a little bit more interesting, in addition to all the drawing techniques that we have covered, is using one special item here called a stencil. And it looks like a little itty bitty tree. I'll click on that. And it brings up a preview of what's going to be inserted into your drawing or drawn into your drawing. And you can scale it by squeezing your fingers or expanding them. And you can actually fill it in two different ways. If I were to use, say, a pencil, and maybe I'll use a fairly large nib, you can kind of color in the figure. And this is, an interesting effect, kind of a little more sketchy look to it. I'll click off the tool here. And that is one way to do it. The alternative way, let's go back. I'll slide this over here. And I'm putting her kind of standing on the window right now. Just choose your paint color, but rather than click on the bucket here, you click on the solid bucket. And what that will do is that will essentially fill in the scale figure. Now, how big do you make the scale figure? Well, the trick is put their feet wherever you want them to stand, and then put their, wherever you think the camera height is, that part of their body. And I actually think this camera height is fairly low, probably 3.5, 4 feet. So I'm gonna guess kind of under her arm is a good reference. So I'm gonna put her feet down at the floor in the foreground here. Whoop, there we go. And I'll put her elbow resting on the horizon line, and I'll just dump paint in there. And what's fun about this feature is it becomes its own object. You can turn it on and off. You can adjust the opacity. And there's tons of different options in here. If you click the little cog, you'll end up seeing the whole library of different people that are available, but also figures, other types of more generic figures, plants. These will all, of course, come in just in the color or the visibility that you have set. Finally, there are other sorts of things like symbols, north arrows, even graphic scales, which is handy if you have set your drawing to scale. And we have not set our drawing to scale, but frequently people will use that. So stencils are a terrific way to make your drawing more interesting. Another thing to take note of when you're drawing your floor plans, your sketched floor plans, or anything, and you're adding fill patterns to these objects is, like I mentioned, the fill patterns don't really work great unless you have a filled area. So sometimes it's nice to actually draw in a cut line, and the cut line, and I'll just do it this way, and I'll draw another one going this way. And a cut line is kind of the graphic symbol for no more plan here. This is the edge of our project. So there are my cut lines. Now, when I use the fill tool, for example, this one here, I'll use the bullet point, and you see it finds the area so much more easily. And now I can come in and add in a flooring pattern or something like that. So it's really nice when you are trying to quickly render an area, sometimes that extra few lines really helps. The same is true if we were to, say, draw the pochette inside the wall. Sometimes it's really nice. See how as I move my cursor, when I get inside that wall, it's actually able to find it. Not sure this is the right hatch pattern for pochette, but sometimes color actually is kind of a nice touch. So let's choose, let's choose purple because purple's so nice. And there you go. You've pochetted your wall quite nicely. One last thing you need to do with this project is to export it. And it's quite simple. There's a share button, and you can share it in any number of file formats. PSD is actually a Photoshop document, so this can be opened in Photoshop. It will retain the layers, and that's kind of a cool feature. If you're using iCloud, that's actually the best way to get the Photoshop document to you. Just save it onto your files here on the iPad. Hopefully your iCloud is working and you can sync it with your computer where you have Photoshop up and running, and you can use the full version. There is an iPad version, but there's kind of no need for it unless really the full version on the computer is the best one. You can also share the project. That's how I have the project shared with you guys. And then you can change the quality. I'm just going to go better for now so that I have some space on my computer. And what it will show you is what it's going to export. You can see here, it's got all the layers in your project. And that's actually kind of fun to see. You don't have to export each of these. You can actually just export the single version. That's great if we're when we go to do our presentation. So you see, you just tap the off button and away go those layers. If you wanted to do additional photo manipulation, or for some reason you wanted just the line work, sometimes that's kind of nice on a board, you can do that. There's also an option to just click this button and it will just export this one view. And that's also handy. So you click save, and it wants to know where you want it to go. Now, if you have a Mac, you can just click AirDrop and drop it onto your Mac. You can also use Dropbox. Or in this case, I can just save the image onto the iPad, and then it will be available in my pictures. And this is great when we go to put together a presentation. I think using something like Google Documents, Google Slides is great. And you can just do it on the iPad and present with your iPad directly. So I would just save it to there. But there's other fun things that you can do. All these kind of instant actions are actually super handy. You can see mine even has Photoshop Express, which is the iPad version.